The Sing Sing Prison Oral History Project is an initiative that aims to document and preserve the rich history of Sing Sing Prison through the stories of those who have been behind the walls of the Big House. The history of Sing Sing is not complete without the inclusion of these voices. The project will begin by filming correction officers at their annual Old Timers Reunion being held at the end of June. Any money raised above the goal will be used to fund the continued filming and editing of oral histories of Sing Sing correction officers. The oral histories will become part of the new Sing Sing Prison Museum. The following excerpts were taken from a test interview that was made for this fundraising campaign. With your help, we hope to fund a series of professional oral histories to capture as many stories as possible before they are lost.
Good afternoon, Bob. How are you today?
Good afternoon, Oz. I'm fine. How you doing? I worked as a correction officer at Sing Sing the vast majority of 26 years.
You came into the department in what year was that?
August 1970.
And you went straight to Sing Sing, or you
went straight to Sing Sing, reported for work, and the day you reported for work is the day you started working. There was no training of any sort whatsoever.
And the uniform of the day was?
Well, it was supposed to be blue, but whatever you happened to have on that day, that was your uniform. And the next day, hopefully, you got a shirt from someplace and a pair of blue trousers, and eventually you found yourself a uniform.
And when you came into work, what equipment did they give you?
You had what they used to call back then a nightstick or a day stick, what they now call a baton. Again, we had no training with it. You were given that, and depending on where you were sent for your assignment for the day, you may have a very large ring of keys, literally hundreds of keys. And you may have gone someplace you've never seen before and had no idea what they were for. But you fudged through the day and you made it, you know. I'm trying to think of the recreation hall that they first sent me to when I went there. They had a stove that was turned on at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the inmates were allowed to cook certain items that they could buy from the commissary, like soup, and heat things up, a can of ravioli, something like that. But yeah, there was a lot of stuff in there. And swag stuff.
Down the hill in the drill rec building.
Probably the chapel rec. It was a chapel rec. It was in the old chapel building, which is now gone.
Turn the
gas stove on. The gas stove was about 100 feet long. I don't know how many burners it had. But yeah, that was one of the first jobs I had. I think probably day one I was in the chapel rec with several hundred inmates, a bunch of keys, and a gas stove. Had no idea what was going on.
Sure. In the basement, the PK's office was downstairs.
It was downstairs. The old death house was downstairs. Yeah. And,
the original death house.
The original death house, yeah.
Prior to the new one.
Prior to the condemned cell building.
Built in.
Which is now a vocational shop, I think. Yes. At least it was last time I was there.
It is now. It's all renovated.
Yeah. New arrivals at the facility, if you want to call them that, the inmates used to come up primarily from the New York City Department of Correction. They came on a bus, which they dubbed the Green Hornet, and it'd be like 30 or 40 inmates at a time, and they'd come right through the front door of the facility. They'd be handcuffed and shackled, and they'd be in civilian clothes, so you had to be extra careful. They were filed in through the front door. Into the back of the building, there was a holding pen, and then when they were brought upstairs where ID was at the time, they were fingerprinted, photographed, civilian clothes taken away from them and sent home and/or stored, and they were issued state clothing at that time, shoes and sneakers or work shoes, and a gray uniform.
Any big changes when you first got into Sing Sing Correctional Facility?
Yes, the first big thing that happened that everyone can recollect that was around at the time was the riot at Attica State Prison. Over 40 people were killed, as I recall, and a lot of that came down to lack of training. They took correction officers and put them in inmate clothing. When the facility was stormed, people were shocked because they didn't know who they were. They were dressed in inmate clothing. There was no CERT team at that time, the Correction Emergency Response Team. Now, as you know, nowadays, any kind of situation like that, the correction personnel will always go in first, so they can identify their fellow officers. If you have a problem at Sing Sing, You get the Sing Sing CERT team in there so you can put eyes on somebody and you know who you're dealing with, no matter what they're dressed in.
Right.
So that was a big change in training, for sure.
After the Attica riot.
After the Attica riot. Our training was minimal prior to that.
In the identification office.
We worked in the ID office, yes. Yeah.
And back then there was a dark room up there.
We had a dark room, we processed all our own film, we developed all our own pictures, printed the pictures. When there was an escape or something, we needed photos because we had the experience of going in and producing pictures on a very quick basis.
And if there was a code blue or an escape of some sort, what was one of our functions up there in the identification office?
With a code blue or an escape or anything like that, we had to get the negative of the person that they were looking for, whether that be inmate or officer. If we have a missing officer, it happens as well, and get those pictures printed as quickly as possible. The first batch would go out wet, so they would be a wet piece of paper, but it had the image on it. And then the next batch that we would send out would be going through the whole process, fixed and dried, so people could handle them, and the image would stay then.
What changes basically have you observed since the Attica riot at Sing Sing?
Well, a lot of changes come along the way. You change procedures all the time, how you do your job, and of course, as you know, there's huge books of policy and procedure for the department. A lot of changes in inmate privileges. It seemed the inmates gained a lot more privileges than we ever had. See, we seem to have lost privileges over the years. The workday became much longer. The inmates are now out in the evening for recreation, for television, around the yard. That never happened in the early 70s and before that. Once they locked in after the evening meal, that was the end of the day. There were very few inmates out unless they had reason to be out. It might have been a plumber, it might have been a clerk, it might have been what they used to call a runner, just to go take things from place to place. But the vast majority of the population was locked in and counted.
And that restriction held up until an incident happened in 1983, was it?
1983, you had hostages taken at Sing Sing in B Block. And that went on for, I forget how long now, 5-6 days.
The changes after that riot at Sing Sing.
I think the changes continued, more leniency for the inmates. You know, when you compare what's gone on in almost 200 years at Sing Sing, some of the things that they used to punish inmates for would be tantamount to torture by today's definition. You know, even to the point of waterboarding. They had a water punishment, as you recall. You've seen the photos of it. That would be considered waterboarding today, which they can now consider torture. But that was punishment for even minor offenses back then. Well, we're going back a couple hundred years now.
Yes.
You know, but those things changed, I think, for the better, obviously. As long as you can keep control of what's going on, then you can still have a functioning facility. When you get to the point where you've given up total control and the inmates are in charge of the asylum, so to speak, then you have a problem.
Is there anything you would do different now?
Given all the changes, you know, at that point I was a young man out of the service looking for a job. And civil service jobs were plentiful. The pay was not great, but it was good and it was steady. It was steady work with decent benefits. I think in today's, knowing what I know now today, and seeing what I see what goes on in the prison, it wouldn't be my first choice.
How about we talk a little bit about some of the residents that were there that people in general call high-profile inmates?
Yeah, we had a few of them in my time there. Joe Gallo was one of them. He was from an alleged organized crime family in Brooklyn. They did movies about him. It was the gang that couldn't shoot straight. There was a book written about it. There was a movie done about it. He was in 7 building, and he was somebody I spoke to on a fairly regular basis. I used to walk by his cell in the morning. When he finally was released, he didn't survive too long. He was killed out in the street by whomever. I have no idea who did that at this time. So.
7 building was a good housing unit.
It was a smaller unit, and typically they would put people there that were not troublesome. Joe Gallo was an organized crime guy, they said, and those fellas seemed to resigned themselves to doing their time. Not that they didn't do things that they weren't supposed to be doing, but they kept a lot of shade on it, and a lot of times things went on that we didn't see or didn't know about. So they were not considered troublesome.
And most of the inmates came from the New York City area?
New York City metropolitan area, yes.
And they were sent to Sing Sing via the Hudson?
Or yeah, via the Hudson River or by train. And later on they went by train, and of course they went up the river, which is the term going to the big house, which was the big house on the Hudson River. And then from that point they would be assigned to a housing unit. And they'd go to A block, B block, 5 building, 7 building, that was it. And over the years that changed, and they started bringing them. That became problematic. It was too busy, too much going on at the front door. And they did have an inmate escape one afternoon. The processing was slow. He was dressed in a business type suit, and at the change of shift, walked out the front door with all the civilians going home.
With the changing of the guard?
With the changing of the guard, so to speak, yeah. So that was part of what changed that procedure. And then they started receiving through 18 post.
Thank you for coming, and we appreciate your candor, and we will see you again.
Okay. Pleasure is mine. Thank you, Alec.